Hey YouTube, welcome to All In Media's review discussion for Another Code Recollection, which just came out earlier this month on the Nintendo Switch, and Eric is going to chat with us all about it. I've not played this, so I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, Eric, and sitting here and talking with you about it. So, if you have never joined us before for an all-in review discussion, here's how it works. First and foremost, we do not issue numbered scores for our reviews. Sorry, Metacritic slash
Yeah.
OpenCritic.
If we did that, Travis touchdown on your microphone would, slice us in half.
Yeah, he's saying moe. He's not saying 10 out of 10 or anything like that.
Exactly.
So we don't do that. But what we do is we give you our 100% honest thoughts. We get very in depth and we chat about these games and let you make your decision as smart, intelligent people. Video games are we feel too complicated to boil down to a number and then move on with our lives. Another thing we do is we break up our conversations, our review discussions, in two parts. So we're going to talk about the story, the presentation, the music, and the gameplay. And we do that for ease of talking and for ease of your listening. So Eric, again, I haven't played this. You're the one that's going to be taking point on this review. I'm excited to hear your thoughts. Because to be honest with you, I played the first Trace Memory when it came out here on DS, and I remember liking it when it came out. Good game. And then I played the demo for this, and it kind of unsold me, to be honest. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how it turned out.
Yeah, the first Trace Memory game was a standout title for me on the original DS. The way that the game really cleverly used the unique aspects of the DS in terms of the puzzle solving is just something that has really always stuck with me. Specifically, one memory, ironically enough, that I have of the game where I thought it was one of the most brilliant uses of any piece of gaming hardware ever. You actually literally had to close the DS in order to stamp something, in order to solve one of the puzzles in Trace Memory, and that was just kind of just a microcosm of the different and unique ways that it implemented the DS's features in order brought it into the puzzle solving. And I really enjoyed it. Admittedly, when it came to the narrative, I had almost completely forgotten about it.
Right.
And we had the West never actually got the follow-up, which was released ultimately on the Nintendo Wii. And this game, Another Code Recollection, which was announced back in September during Nintendo's 2023 September Direct, was simultaneously announced essentially as a bundle, but also as kind of a cohesive melding of both of the games. This is not a typical game collection where you can say, oh, I want to play this game, or oh, I want to play this game. This is an experience that basically turns two games into a single ongoing experience. And I was interested to see kind of how that played out, because that also meant, a few things from a narrative point of view, and a few things from, just trying to decide how they were going to tie things together from a gameplay perspective, and, stuff that we'll get into, frankly. But yeah, if you've never checked out Trace Memory, or Another Code as it was known in the East, it is a twosome of games following a young girl named Ashley Mizuki Robbins on her quest to kind of, recover a lot of her memories, uncover the truth about certain things, and, solve a little mysteries, aka some kind of new age Nancy Drew style.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. And I want to, well, and I know that you were saying, I feel the same way about the first Trace Memory. Like you said, we never got the second one here, so I hadn't played it. But the first one feels like, it feels like a Trace Memory, I guess. Like I feel like I don't remember a lot of what happened with that game, but from what I understand, and I don't know how much you can speak to this, having A, not played the second one before, and B, not having a great recollection of the first one, but I've heard that they actually changed the story like significantly to make it kind of fit into this new mold, because the game is like, the actual setup of the game is quite different. And so they, from what I understand, actually had to kind of reformat the whole thing. Like the reviewer, I don't remember the man's name, but the reviewer for IGN was talking about how when he had played the second game originally on Wii, it took him like 30 hours or something like that. And he's like, with this, I played through both games in like 13 hours. So
Yeah, that sounds about right.
yeah. So it sounds like it's changed pretty dramatically.
Yes, and again, a lot of that has to do with taking two disparate experiences and kind of melding them into kind of a
Mm-hmm.
single, basically like two-act game, effectively. And I am excited to talk about it, but I was excited about this interview specifically because I think Another Code Recollection is a very good example of why we don't do numbered scores, is
Mm.
because I do ultimately have some pretty complicated thoughts, some pretty positive thoughts about this game, but also some fairly strong negative thoughts about this game. And I know we always start with narrative,
Mm-hmm.
and I do want to preface everything that I'm about to say with the game does deal with a decent amount of child harm.
Okay.
You meet a young ghost boy fairly early on in the first part of the game, and that what happened to that young boy winds up becoming a pretty big part of the mystery that you're unraveling for that first half, and maybe even some stuff beyond that. So I will say I do know that that is a trigger point for a lot of people. So I just wanted to preface everything and say if that's already a deal breaker for you, then the game does do a little bit with child harm.
Good call.
It's certainly not graphic,
Mm-hmm.
um, but if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, it is properly sad. What happens to you know that and maybe other characters throughout the course of the game. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, that's good to know. You had mentioned this character Ashley is kind of at the heart of it, and just
Yep.
from what I had played from the demo and kicking into the story of the first game, the setup is like she's going to like meet her dad or something on an island. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. The setup for the first half of the game is, I think, really striking. So the setup for the first part of the narrative is it is the day before Ashley Robbins' 14th birthday. Her father, who her entire life she thought dead,
Mm-hmm.
just sent her a letter saying, "I want you to come to Blood Edward Island. I want to meet you." Um, so that is kind of at the heart of this original mystery. Is Ashley is going to this ominously named place to meet a father that she had thought dead up until yesterday, and then immediately upon getting to the island, her aunt Jessica winds up going missing, and she almost immediately runs into the ghost of a young boy. So, very quickly out the gate, you have a very large, multi tiered mystery to unravel. What's going on with her father? Why wasn't he there? What's going on with him now? Where did her aunt go? Why did she disappear? What's going on with this young ghost boy? And what is the mystery behind this device called the DAS, the Dual Another system, uh, which some people on Twitter have been kind of jokingly referring to as the Switch 2, because similarly to in the original DS, Ashley's father sends her essentially, effectively, a DS that
Yeah,
is modeled to be a high tech instrument and used cleverly in all the puzzle solving in the game, as kind of a just a funny little in joke. Very much how like Dr. Egad uses like the Virtual Boy in
totally.
Luigi's Mansion and stuff. Yeah. So Ashley has this, instead of a DS this time, she has a very high tech looking version of a DS, of a Switch Lite, that's called the Dual Another system this time around, that is biometrically linked to her, only works for her. And so you've got all this stuff going on with this young ghost boy. You've got the mystery behind her father. You've got the mystery of her missing aunt, and you got to figure out how in the world this biometrically linked device, ties into everything that's going on this island. So right out the gate, there's actually quite a bit of intrigue. And I will say, to the game's strength, when it comes to the narrative, I do think that both the first and second parts of the game do a very good job in terms of breadcrumbs, just the right amount of information at the right time to keep you hooked, just the right amount of reveals, the right pacing of information, or the right pacing of what you need to know to kind of just keep you going, just to keep you on the hook. I think the game does that extraordinarily well from a narrative standpoint. There are a couple issues I have with the dialogue. There are some there's some weirdly written parts of the game. Uh, Maybe a good microcosm would just be when Ashley would walk into a room with pots, pans, and clearly a bunch of cooking utensils on the wall. She would just walk into the room and go like, "Oh, where am I now?" You know. So
Okay.
there is some of that like weird janky cringe going on, but overall a lot of the narrative and the interplay, because it is a very character driven story, but a lot of that, which is very much at the heart of mystery narratives, I think that's very well paced, very well done, and ultimately I think the payoff is really good, because again, this is a narrative told in two parts, and I certainly don't want to spoil any more of the narrative for the first half of the game. But I will say, once you get to the second half of the game, it is now 2 years later.
Okay.
Ashley is now 16. And at this point in her life, she is trying to cope with many of the changes that have come into her life since the events of the first game. And she's kind of coming to grips with things, but a lot of new challenges have begun to arise. And she winds up finding herself at this campsite, which doubles as the work site for someone in her family. And then other things kind of start to come up as of that. Her backpack is immediately stolen. She winds up running into this time alive boy who turns out to have some mysteries that need solving. As far as he goes, there are some weirdness going on at this camp / job site, and Ashley winds up having to do her Nancy Drew thing again. I will say, for the second half, I do think the narrative, there are a few points in the narrative where I think it asks you to suspend your disbelief just a little bit too much. There's a couple points in the second half of the game where it's literally something to where, I'm sorry, this terrible thing has happened and now you have to deal with it. Then quite literally gets a phone call. Oh, cool. Everything turned out fine and everything's good now.
Wow.
Like the most blatant kind of Deus Ex Machina,
Clean wrap up sort
exactly,
of thing.
yeah. So there are a couple moments like that, but it is two kind of very distinct stories, but the way they thread in and out of each other, it is, very much two halves of a single experience. But the way that they individually kind of wrap up, I think, is very satisfying. And then the way the second narrative specifically wraps up and then wraps that up with what happened in the first game, I think that is also well done. There's a pretty lengthy sequence at the end of the game that felt kind of straight out of something like an Agatha Christie novel, to where, here's laid out why everything happened, exactly why it happened, and the motivations behind the people who did the thing. But I do think that was ultimately well handled. The narrative, I think, it's in the first half specifically, I do think is stronger. I think there were a couple parts in the second half. It doesn't get going quite as fast. The narrative in the second half doesn't really start hitting its stride until the final couple chapters. There's enough there to, again, keep you on the hook, but it does feel like a little bit of a lull compared to the first half. But ultimately, as scatterbrained as I'm afraid, this portion of the review is, my final thoughts on the narrative are, ultimately, I think it was well written, satisfying, wrapped up nicely. I think the first half was notably better. I do have a couple problems with the pacing and the kind of the tonality and the structure of the second half, but ultimately, I think that this is a story that was very well structured. And I know I said that was final thoughts, but I do also want to make mention of the fact that I do also very much respect the strength of theming in this story. We find so many stories out there that are just kind of written, things happen and then more things happen, but there was very, very clearly thoughts behind the specific themes that the writers wanted to touch on in these games, and those themes are continued to be strengthened and continue to be revisited throughout the narratives in multiple ways. The two main themes of Another Code Recollection are just memory, which may seem obvious, but this idea of memory and exploring thoughts behind why characters may not retain memories and how memories even work and how much they impact our life, and just honestly a really good analysis of the idea of memory. Some people may roll their eyes at the thought of an amnesiac protagonist, and I do get that, but when it comes to characters having to regain memories in this game, I do think it is incredibly well handled from that aspect and does actually make a lot of sense from a narrative standpoint. And the other big theme that is very prevalent throughout the entire game is the imperfect relationship between a parent and their child. That is something that is very, very often revisited throughout the entirety of the experience. So a lot of respect, because again, those two themes in particular were very clearly a focal point of the story and were visited multiple times in multiple ways across this game. So that was very, very clearly a big, just a big point, a big, oh my God, what's the theme I'm looking for?
Theme?
Big focus. There we go. Of the story. But yeah, I know when it comes to the narrative is a big part of this game because it is ultimately, very much like a 3D point and click adventure. This game, in large respect, is going to live and die by the strength of its story. And I do think that overall, it does a very good job. The story itself is a little imperfect, but I came away from the narrative feeling very good about that part of the game's execution.
Nice. Cool. Yeah, I mean that's a huge part of what this game is. Well, and I will say too, just for clarity, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but looking at this game from the outside looking in, like if you're a layperson seeing Another Code for the first time, you might be forgiven for thinking this is like a new Life is Strange game or something like that.
It does kind of have those vibes, and there were a couple times where I had like just very brief flashbacks to playing True Colors, which we reviewed here on the show a couple of years ago at this point. But yeah, I mean, this game does have a fairly different aesthetic, but yeah, I think that you certainly could be forgiven for thinking that this game took a lot of inspiration from that. And honestly, this version of the game may very well have.
Yeah, well, and I want to make a point to make sure that it's clear to the listener that there is not, as far as I'm aware, you can correct me if I'm wrong, like branching narrative or player choice or anything like that, like you would see in a Life is Strange. This is a set story.
Yes, the narrative is incredibly linear. The the only real element like that is there are some times when you're talking to characters where you get to choose the next topic that
Mm,
you talk about, but that's really it. All the dialogue in the game is kind of mandatory when it comes to that. So, and weirdly, even when some of those choices pop up, you only get a single choice. So that's kind of weird. But no, there's not any like you'd see in a Life is Strange, or like you'd see in a Telltale game, where if you make a choice, this character will remember that.
right.
Stuff like that doesn't exist here. It's very much a linear A to B story that's very structured and very intentionally told.
Hmm. That's good. Good to be aware of. Well, I guess moving into the presentation, this is, I mean, maybe like the biggest thing that they had to kind of like restructure, because this was a DS game. So
Yeah.
spoilers, it didn't look like this on the Nintendo DS. They had to make this a 3D sort of like over the shoulder third
Yes.
person adventure game.
Yes. So that was part of turning this into a single experience, was the cohesion of the gameplay. You take a series that was split between the Nintendo DS and the Nintendo Wii, and you basically create a single gameplay engine to encapsulate the entire experience. The presentation, I will say, just positives right out the gate. The game did run at an incredibly steady frame rate the entire time I played the game. It may have even been a rock solid 60. It was,
Mm.
admittedly, the character animations were kind of hard to tell, but it ran at a steady frame rate. I never really encountered a bug, and I never encountered a crash. From a performance standpoint, the game ran flawlessly the entire time. So I will say that right out the gate. Because while the character models look fine, Ashley's character model specifically looks fine, and many of the indoor environments are passable, there is a lot about this game that just frankly looks bad, like
Hmm.
really bad. And I hate to say that, but especially in a lot of the outdoor environments, of which the second half of the game is mostly outdoors, like it I'm not somebody, I grew up on the NES, so low graphical fidelity is not something that immediately strikes me. And that being said, I was running around this game, and it really struck me how low fidelity this game looks. And I mean, ultimately, it's not something that's going to affect the gameplay necessarily. But when I say this, the logs were literally octagons. I'm saying the rocks were literally 10 polygons.
Mm.
I'm saying the many of the outdoor environments in this game just look, I hate to say, like Wii era,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
but yeah, kinda. And if you're doing this kind of remake for 2024, when we have games, I mean, we just had a PlayStation State of Play a couple days ago. Like, I understand the Nintendo Switch compared to those pieces of hardware, but in 2024 to release a game that looks so far behind what we're coming to expect, I I couldn't let the game slide in that regard. So
Yeah.
I've got to call it like it is. Again, it's not something that's going to affect the gameplay, and it's not something that, you know, what was a game breaker for me, but this is an honest review, and I've got to grade you based on what I see. And what I see was frankly very unimpressive in that regard. And even beyond that, many of the character animations, like even though there was motion capture in the credits, many of the character motions frankly looked unnatural. Like many of the characters in the game just learned how to run yesterday.
Hmm.
It was really bizarre. So from a graphical presentation standpoint, there's a lot about this game that's that already feels incredibly outdated, which, you kind of hate to see, unfortunately. Like I said, from a performance standpoint, ran beautifully. And, I don't mind the art direction. I do think that given the previous games, I think, kind of this bright, colorful, pseudo anime cartoonish look was a good choice. That being said, you've got to follow through with it. And, ultimately the presentation just is not up to snuff in a large portion of this game. The indoor environments, like I said, are mostly passable, but yeah.
Mm, that's unfortunate. Yeah, I noticed that playing the demo too. The demo is just the opening of the first game, really, and you're in this
Yeah.
kind of foresty environment in the beginnings of the island. There's a little bit of the indoor stuff, but yeah, um, Wii was exactly the comparison I was gonna make. Like it does, like the textures are very low res, and it's not even really doing like the Skyward Sword thing where it's taking advantage of low res textures and making it this kind of watercolory look.
Yeah.
Like it looks like maybe it's flirting with that, but like this it almost confirms what I sort of knew to be true about this, which is that this project did not have a high budget. They didn't have a lot to work with here, I don't think.
That wouldn't surprise me, but I mean, yeah,
It's unfortunate.
it is. Now, when it comes to the presentation, one thing I will say is the end credits sequence of Another Code Recollection is phenomenal.
Okay.
It's legitimately amazing. Once you actually finish the story and the credits start rolling, there is this wonderfully, like, kind of hand drawn Adam. You know how it looks when like individual sketches are animated? They've got this wonderfully, beautifully animated sequence uh, that plays. That's frankly my favorite thing about the game,
Wow.
and it's absolutely stunning. It is incredibly spoilery because part of the end credit sequence is one of those, very quick kind of status updates on many of the other characters within the game. Where are they now, kind of deal.
Sure.
Uh, but the end credit sequence is genuinely special in this game, and I did want to shout that out. Whoever did that aspect of this game deserves their flowers, and I will send them some.
Nice. Very good. Well, I don't want to rush you off presentation. Did you have any more final thoughts on
No,
presentation?
not really. Actually,
Okay.
I guess we can talk about the performances here just
Okay.
very briefly. The audio performances, all the dialogue in the game is voice acted, which is good to hear. Like if you're running around just clicking on stuff, um, you know, they won't get into fully voice acted conversations, but all the required dialogue in the game is all fully voice acted from every character in the game, which is cool to see. And by and large, the performances are good, especially from the young lady who performs Ashley.
Hmm.
The voice of Ashley is honestly exactly how I always imagined she'd sound. She is a very good cast for Ashley, and especially in many of the more, I guess, shall we say, emotional moments. I think
Sure.
she does a very good job. There are a couple kind of off moments when it comes to some of the cast. Again, by and large, the performances are good, but there are a couple members of the cast that can't really believably carry the more emotional moments. And it does sometimes, especially in the second half of the game, come off as unintentionally funny in a few brief moments.
Okay.
Uh, but overall, again, all the required dialogue throughout this entire 12, 13-hour experience is all fully voice acted, and most of the performances are good, which is, it's very nice to, like, if you want to speed through the dialogue options, you can set it to autoplay, like in many games we see that kind of quality of life feature pop up now, where you can just set it to autoplay. But if you want to just speed through the dialogue, you can. But honestly, I recommend, listening to these characters and listening to them bounce off of each other, because the voice actors did a pretty good job in here as well.
Nice. Very, very good. I was trying to look up the IMDb. I couldn't find the IMDb page for this because I was curious what the voice cast was like. But
Yeah, I looked it up when I was watching the credits. It was a name that I was unfamiliar with,
okay,
and I did very much like that. Honestly, the entire cast, from the American voice actors especially, was not a lot of names that I
cool.
recognized. Not a lot of Laura Baileys and Travis Willinghams and Troy
Hmm.
Bakers and Steve Blooms. It was a lot of unknown names, which you and I have both mentioned that we really like to see.
Cool. Yeah, very good. Well, I wanted to pivot you because normally we talk about music next. The only piece of music from this game that I've heard beyond just what I heard in the demo, which was fine, it was kind of giving me, what it was reminding me of, is giving me some like Joe Hisaishi vibes a little bit, like Studio Ghibli vibes a little bit.
Kind of,
Some
yeah.
like kind of wilting piano stuff, but you linked in our Discord the like
Yes,
end credits song, and that
yes,
was pretty good.
yeah. So the end credit song, which is titled "The Place I Call Home," is, I think, a genuinely great and lovely song, and does a lot to enhance that already great end credit sequence. Which is, kind of why I wanted to try to save the end credit sequence to last, just so I could pivot into that song.
Sure.
I do recommend checking that song out. If you look up nothing else from this game, look up "To the Place I Call Home." I will say, be careful about which version you bring up, because if you do bring
Mm,
up the actual end credits, like just a video capture of the end credits, again, that is very spoilery.
good to know.
So, but yeah, the song itself is really, really good, and far and away the high point of the music of Another Code Recollection. In addition to having a really great song in that aspect, it also has one of maybe my most hated songs on the Nintendo Switch.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So I mentioned that the second half of the game occurs at this kind of campsite area. There is I guess, kind of goofy movie style, jamboree
Lester's Possum
mascot,
Park?
kind of.
Yes.
There's not like an actual animatronic band or anything,
Hmm.
but there is an actual theme song akin to that plays in one of the buildings on loop, on repeat, and it is one of the worst things I've ever heard in my life.
Amazing.
Uh,
I gotta look this
but I
up
mean,
now.
oh god, it's so bad. It's so bad. But I was really happy to hear "To the Place I Call Home," because, to be completely honest, when it comes to the music and the entire rest of the game, and this was something I was actively trying to listen to, and the words that kept coming to my mind were, "This is just music I feel like I'd be happy to hear if I were riding in an elevator."
Mm, yeah.
Like, it wasn't necessarily good music, but it was better than no music, and occasionally there is no music, but the music didn't really come off as special at all. It just felt like decent elevator music most of the time. Um, and just because of how much dialogue and narrative there is in the game, a lot of the runtime will be taken up with characters talking to each other and
Hmm.
actual, spoken human dialogue. So, the amount of the amount of gameplay and the amount of game time that you would genuinely hear, songs is not as much as you would think.
Sure.
However, again, just like the presentation aspect, I gotta just like with that, I had to call it like I see it. With this, I gotta call it like I hear it. If you can make it to the end credits, there's a banger there, but you got to deal with a whole lot of mediocre leading up to that.
Wow. Yeah. That was sort of the vibe I got from the demo. It was like, like I said, maybe some light, kind of Joe Hisaishi inspiration. I could kind of see what maybe they were going for, but nothing sticky about it or special about it whatsoever,
If
from what I've heard.
if you had told me that, you've already kind of mentioned that you think the game was low budget. If you
Hmm.
had told me that most of the ambient moment to moment music in the game was just taken from like an expensive public domain library or something,
Right.
I'd 100% believe you.
Yeah. It may well have been. Like I said,
May well have been.
yeah, the whole project feels a little low budge to me, unfortunately. Well, I guess to pivot into gameplay, normally we say like, gameplay is like the biggest part, but in this, the story probably is. But I am curious to know what's going on with the gameplay here.
Well, again, this is a kind of two-part point and click adventure. So a lot of the gameplay is going to be solving these puzzles that you come across every once in a while. The puzzles are essentially there to break up the monotony of the constant dialogue. But I will say this was something that I was really specifically looking to, just because the few memories that I have of the original were of how uniquely it used the Nintendo DS's unique features to play directly into the puzzle solving. So I was very interested to see how this game was going to do that for the Nintendo Switch. And to be fair, there are some very unique puzzle solving aspects that honestly could really only be done with the Nintendo Switch very quickly. And I think this was part of the demo, the stool.
The stool, man. That stool. So yeah, let me ask you about the stool. The stool is one of the things, and I talked about this on the podcast when the demo came out. I was playing that demo, and I get to this stool, and the setup of the stool is there's a key inside of it that you have to like use the gyro to turn the stool and kind of jiggle the key out of the stool and use the key to open a gate. That's all fine. The gyro in that section was so bad. Like in the demo anyway. I don't know if it's been fixed in the final game, but I struggled.
In the final game, I actually had no issue.
Okay, well that's good. That's good.
I think it worked actually fairly well. I did wind up having to maneuver it quite a bit. It wasn't just something to where I could tilt it back and forth a little bit. No, I actually had to like turn it upside down and hold it in a way you absolutely wouldn't hold a controller. But I mean, that equated to basically turning the stool upside down and right side up and trying to jangle the key down into the little opening slot that you were supposed to get it into. But that aspect of the game, I didn't feel like I had much issue with, and I didn't really have an issue with how that controlled.
I tell you, man, in that demo, I probably spent 15 minutes on that key. And then I was like, is this a me thing or is it just bad? And then I went on Twitter and I saw like 4 friends complaining about it. And then I listened to the Nintendo dads and their podcast, and they complain. I was like, okay, so it's not just me. So I'm glad the final game, ironed some of that gyro stuff out, because to be honest, that was a huge turnoff for me. That was the moment I was like, I'm probably not going to pick this up.
Maybe I just got lucky with my copy or something in the game. Yeah. Maybe a lot of people would still have issues, but I do think that was one of the more unique aspects, one of the more unique puzzle solves in the game, was again just having to like turn the controller upside down and use that much of the gyro controls in order to manipulate the environment. Now, the game still does do a good job of finding unique ways to implement puzzle solves into it, to the point where a couple times, even frustratingly, there are a couple times the game will only use a mechanic once for the sake of keeping things unique constantly. They'll only use a mechanic once, and you may not even be aware that that mechanic exists. So there were a couple times where I did get stuck on something because I didn't know that what it wanted me to do was even a thing. So there is that a couple times. I will say, just for the sake of, you can overlap photos. Just be aware of that. That's all I'm going to say. You can overlap photos. That should hopefully save you 15 minutes at a certain part of the game.
Wow.
But, talking about overlapping photos, a lot of what you're going to do within the game is governed by this DAS, is governed by this dual another system. Not only is it this mystery in and of itself that you have to solve, but it is also your camera. It is also the device that contains all the information. It has your map, and it's basically your entire menu screen, everything that you need it for. Weirdly enough, apparently it has almost no memory to it because it can only store 10 photos at a time.
Wow.
Yeah, but it is a very central part of the gameplay experience throughout both halves of the game. And I will say, even when you get to the second half, you can still like return to the information from the first half.
Oh, cool.
There's a big aspect of the DAS's functionality is kind of keeping the characters in line and their relationships and new information you find out about them, because there are a lot of characters to keep track of. This is ultimately a mystery, and a mystery needs more than just, 3 characters. So trying to keep all the characters and their relationships and their dynamics in line. There's this kind of big virtual cork board on the DAS that you can use. But even when you get to the second part of the game, you can return to, just kind of look up stuff, and, it's still there if you want to check it out.
Nice.
Just for evs. But just in terms of the puzzle solving, specifically in the first half of the game, there were a couple that frustrated me, but I thought the pacing of the puzzles was very good. I thought the solves were very good. There was one specifically that frustrated me in the first half, but once I realized, I was like, that's fair. That's 100% fair. That's on me. I really liked the uniqueness of it. I really liked how the puzzles kind of brought the mansion together, because in the first half of the game, a lot of the game happens around this singular mansion on Blood Edward Island, and the way that the puzzles kind of narratively wrapped the game together and this building together, and I thought worked really well in tandem with the narrative. I thought the design of the puzzles was actually synergistic with the narrative and very well done in that regard. And I think there were just enough puzzles to keep the game interesting, to keep the pace going, and to keep my brain occupied, because I'm a dum-dum.
Well, let me ask you this, because I remember hearing you talk on the podcast when you first started playing the game, and you said that like it was kind of tapping into you were having a certain nostalgic reaction to it. And a big question that I think a lot of people who have played the first game will have is like, how do they translate DS specific puzzles to the Switch? The stamp thing you're talking about, like, what did they do there? Like how they solve for that, right?
Honestly, I don't think that puzzle specifically exists in this version of the game. I was looking specifically for that as well. And when you were talking earlier about the IGN reviewer who had previously played the Wii version of the game, and we had kind of touched on this idea of restructuring the game, I do think that there was a lot of that going on. Now, when I was going through it, and specifically when it comes to the narrative and some of the interactions, the memories, and some of the set pieces, there were things that were, ironically enough, triggering a few memories of my own. But there were several parts of the game where I was like, this feels like a Switch exclusive puzzle, or this isn't something I really remember at all from the original, or I don't feel like this would have worked at all if this had been on the DS, kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, the stool thing couldn't have worked on the DS, right?
Well, the DS had slight gyro, but
it's interesting when you look at like what this game sort of has to do. It's a difficult job, and we've seen some games, especially like touch heavy games, that have just solved for this by, well, let's put a pointer in there with like motion controls, or map it to the stick or whatever, and so it is kind of interesting to see how especially DS ports handle the transition.
For the first half, I think the puzzles were well conceived. I think they were well paced, and I think they broke up the game at the right intervals. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for the second half of the game. The puzzles in the second half of the game felt so much more sparse. It felt like I was talking to people forever, to the point where when I found something that felt like a puzzle, I was elated. Like, finally, I get to actually play something. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, with a few exceptions, a lot of the times I would run into the puzzles in the second half of the game. They'd be such simple solves that they were actually kind of disappointing, unfortunately.
Mm.
There was one specifically that was a 4-button combination. And I was like, cool, I got to do some investigating, got to actually put my brain to work. Cool, this is. And then I turn around and the 4-button combination in its entirety is like right under the tab of
Oh.
an item. And I'm just like, so a lot from a gameplay perspective, the puzzle solves were kind of deflating. And they even introduced a couple things in the second half of the game, specifically this weird thing about cleaning up the campsite. Like, you could find loose cans, bring them to this can recycler machine, get tokens, and then you could use those tokens. Like, they introduced this entire thing, but turns out you can just use them in like a gumball machine. And then there's just a very quick animation where Ashley just pops it in her mouth, literally doesn't even open her mouth as part of the animation, doesn't even make a chewing animation. It's like, oh, that one tasted blue. And then,
Wow.
so from a gameplay perspective, the second half of the game did not really satisfy me whatsoever,
Mm.
unfortunately, which did kind of leave, because, that's the end of the game. So from a gameplay perspective, I didn't really end on a high note. But again, from a narrative, gameplay, and most other standpoints, I think the first half of the game specifically is very, very strong. I've already spoken about the presentation and the music, but the part that was based off of the Wii title, I think, is notably less satisfying. That being said, it's not like I didn't enjoy my time
Sure.
with it. There was still, again, a lot of interesting stuff going on narratively, even if, again, it didn't really ramp up until the end. But just from a gameplay perspective, I mean, you can only run around and click on people and dialogue options so many times. Now, if you're worried about solving puzzles, if, it's like, well, Eric's a dum dum, but what if I have a lot of trouble with these puzzles? There is a hint system in the game.
Mm.
And I feel like it's something that we're starting to see more and more in puzzle games like this. It is a 3-tiered hint system,
Yep.
to where at any point in the game, whatever your next objective is, you can activate the hint and it will give you kind of a basic hint. Then you can activate, like, if you really need to, you can activate an enhanced hint. And if you're still having trouble, you can just have the game tell you, like, okay, go do this.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do have any trouble with some of the puzzles, and again, a couple of them can be fairly obtuse because of how many of them only use a certain mechanic or a certain element of the functionality a single time. So I wouldn't be surprised if you did have to resort to that once or twice throughout the playthrough. There is also a unique piece of functionality to where you can have this little compass kind of appear almost as like a halo around Ashley, which
Okay.
will constantly point in the direction of where you should be going.
Okay. I like that.
So, there is help, and there is accessibility features there for people who are kind of scared about, or who are getting frustrated with whatever part they happen to be stuck on.
Nice. Okay. I like, yeah, accessibility is always good.
Of course.
Love that. Love options for players, especially people who might feel. And I think that 3-tiered, so that's the way to go with stuff like this.
Yeah, I think it's really good.
Yeah, just everybody, if it's a game like this, just do that. Like, I think that's just the way you handle this. Yeah, is there any other like big parts of the, I mean, it's dialogue heavy, it's story heavy. You got your
Yeah.
puzzles. Is there any other facet to the gameplay you want to highlight?
Honestly, no, because I mean, this isn't an RPG. There's no equipment. There's no
Mhm.
stats. There's no platforming. The gameplay really just kind of boils down to, when you're in an area, you're you're in an environment, you kind of go around, you click the A button on certain things to investigate them, you find the puzzles, and then you solve them. I will say there are a couple very good standout puzzles in the game, very good. There are a couple even in the second half that are very good. I do hope that people find as much enjoyment out of those puzzles as I did. But in terms of the gameplay, again, point and click adventure, like you said earlier, this is a very narrative heavy game. So I do respect the game for trying to change up the different ways to solve. Some of them involve like little mini games and even micro games, which had varying degrees of tightness of control. But that's basically where you found a lot of the gameplay variety, is in the solves themselves, essentially. And to be fair, in that regard, there was quite a bit of variety, maybe even too much, but I do respect the game for that.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, any final thoughts? I know you've had some complicated emotions on this one.
Yes.
What's your sort of final takeaway for Another Code Recollection?
My final takeaway is there is a genuinely great game hidden in here somewhere. Like an actually stellar game hidden in here beneath Another Code Recollection. The performances, I think, were good. The narrative, with a little tightening, could be very, very good, with some presentational glow up, some new music, and with a little bit tighter game design when it comes to the puzzles, and maybe even adding in a few more. Considering we just got a remake of these games, I almost hate to say this, but I think that if this version of the game got a proper remake, there's a chance for greatness here. But as it stands, because of the issues that I had, even though I did enjoy playing it, it is a very slow-paced game. Some of the puzzles can be frustrating. It's not very impressive visually.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very impressive musically. So, despite the positives, it is a game that I feel like is kind of hard for me to recommend to other people. If you're a hardcore fan of point and click adventures, I feel like it's much easier to recommend to you, but this is certainly not a game that would make a fan of point and click adventures, in my opinion. I think the narrative is there, and maybe they can build on that for a future remake, but again, unfortunately, as it stands right now, Another Code Recollection sits in a weird limbo for me, where I ultimately am glad I played it, and I ultimately came down on a more positive side of the fence, but I really can't discount the significant issues that I do have with the game, and those are issues that were enough that would keep me from recommending to many people, unfortunately. But ultimately, like I said, I'm still glad I played it, and if you do wind up picking it up, I hope you enjoy it as well. But it's not something that I'm going to tell you to go out and pick up right now. It's not even a game, frankly, that even if it was on sale, that I would say go ahead and pick up right now. But I don't know. Those are just my thoughts.
Well, I mean, thank you for sharing them.
Thank you.
Thank you for reporting back and letting us know your experience. Let us know in the comments below if you've played it, if you love these games, if you agree with Eric, if you disagree with Eric. Leave us a comment. Let us know. And, of course, we have a free, friendly, and welcoming Discord community. Yep. I'm sure there's links to that in the video description. I'm sure Eric would love to chat with you about it there, too.
Yeah.
And, actually, hop into that.
I forgot. You can unlock a new shirt for Ashley when you beat the game. 10 out of 10.
10 out of 10. 10 out of 10. You got it. Yeah. And of course, for more Nintendo video content just like this, you're already in the right place. All In Media right here on YouTube. Like and subscribe before you head out. We appreciate it. For myself, for Eric, this has been our review for Another Code Recollection. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Don't make us a memory.